Book International and Comparative Employment Relations is being published as the 6th edition with a new subtitle, National Regulation Global Changes, and it's being published by Allen Unwin in Australia and New Zealand and Sage in the rest of the world. My name's Greg Bamber. I'm at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm lucky enough to be a visiting professor also at Newcastle University in England. Thank you.
And I'm Chris Wright from the University of Sydney.
And I'm Russell Lansbury, also from the University of Sydney.
And I'm Nick Wailes from UNSW Australia.
Well, Greg, the book is both international and comparative in the sense that we deal, certainly in the first chapter and throughout the book, with international aspects to do with the multinational corporations, the international trade union movement, the institutions such as the ILO. But in each chapter, we deal with a different country. We look at the Asian and emerging economies, and in Asia we look at the developed European economies, we look at the Anglo-Saxon world, Australia and the United States and UK and Canada. So it's a very comprehensive book. It's a book which can be used at different levels. It has a similar structure for each country so that people can make comparisons, but it also goes into quite a deal of depth into each country. And we should also comment that this is the 6th edition, so this has been through a number of different phases over a number of different years. Sometimes we've got writers who've been with us throughout that period, but we are introducing each time a new set of authors who update and bring the book right up to the present moment.
So the first chapter of the book really sets up the comparative and international study of employment relations, and it essentially does two things. Firstly, it talks about why and how you compare employment relations across countries. So it talks about the different ways that you can compare, some of the pitfalls, but also some of the advantages. And what we see as the main advantage of comparing one country to another or a range of different countries is it really helps you understand why employment relations are like they are, why labour markets are like they are, and why you have differences in economic performance. So that's the real critical first bit of the chapter. The second bit of the chapter introduces quite an influential framework, which is called the Varieties of Capitalism framework, that has been very influential in the social sciences, and we think is a really great starting point for students thinking about comparing how labour markets are structured and work is regulated, to think about how to structure that comparison. Later in the book, we then go on and say, are there other things other than the Varieties of Capitalism framework? But the introductory chapter really sets you up for that.
So in the conclusion, we take all the evidence presented in the earlier chapters focusing on the individual countries into account, and we come to the conclusion that there are still distinct systems of employment relations operating, and that the Varieties of Capitalism framework is very helpful for allowing us to understand why this is the case. But we also come to the conclusion that some of the unique features of these national systems are starting to gradually erode. And we argue that there's several reasons for this. Firstly, because the different countries are becoming more diverse internally for various reasons. We also find that non-standard forms of employment are becoming more common across pretty much all of the countries that we study in the book. And we also find that international factors, such as the rise of multinational corporations, the growing influence of global supply chains, and also the growing influence of international organisations on labour standards that are applied universally, are also becoming more influential. So we say that the Varieties of Capitalism framework is still useful, but perhaps we need to take a more nuanced or more complex approach than presented.
We're in discussions with other colleagues about the possibilities of making the book available in other languages as well.
So, Greg, I can answer that question from a couple of different perspectives. I don't know if you know this, but I was a student, and the second edition of this book was my textbook as a student. And the book really changed my life because, when I started studying that subject, I thought I'm really interested in this stuff. And it was a really great way to get into what was happening in Japan and what was happening in the US. And I was really curious about what was different. And I think that that's the way that I'd really suggest if you're thinking about adopting this book. The real strength of it is it gives clear, consistent treatments of some really interesting countries. So not just the developed countries anymore, but we've also got India and China and Korea and a whole lot of where the centre of the world economy is moving to. And because of the consistent, clear structure, students are able to look at how unions operate in this country and why it's different in that country and to make direct comparisons. So it's really quite powerful to have that consistent treatment. But I also think because of the introductory chapter raises a theory and gives you a framework, and then the concluding chapter contests that theory and looks at different interpretations, then they actually work really well as your introductory and your concluding lectures or the frameworks around which you might build assessment. So I think, I know as a student, I found this approach incredibly interesting and really, sort of opened my eyes to the subject. And I think that the sixth edition retains that characteristic, but in some ways it's a much more interesting world now.
This book certainly can be used for teachers of international human resource management as well. And the reason for that is because it provides a strong focus on the context in which human resource management takes place. It looks at the various actors involved in the employment relationship, employers, but also unions and governments, other actors who play a strong role in providing the context of the framework for human resource management, and also looks at key issues around the employment relationship, like training, like remuneration, like the factors that influence productivity. So it certainly is an appropriate book for anybody seeking to provide a broader contextual focus of international human resource management as well.
Well, Chris, I've used it in both ways with students to ask them to make comparisons between both similar and different countries, but I was been quite influenced by Nick's work comparing Australia and New Zealand for his doctoral thesis, in which he talked about the importance of small differences. And I found this to be quite a powerful teaching technique to get students to look at, for example, China and India, or the United States and Canada, Australia and Britain, to see where countries might have a lot in common, might have started off in a very similar manner, but their industrial relations, employment relations activities and policies and practices have diverged, in some cases converged. And this makes for, I think, a very interesting conversation and learning.
Thanks, Russ. And another way in which we've used the book is to encourage students to do further research themselves on particular countries. So the book provides a point of departure if they're wishing to do a project, perhaps individually or in a small team, comparing China and India, or the US and Canada, Britain, Australia, or whatever. The book provides only a starting point, but it also gives further sources. So there are websites where students can get up-to-date data. The further reading is offered for each country that's included in the book. So students can then go into much greater depth, and they can perhaps make a presentation back to the class on their conclusions, comparing a couple of different countries. And that's a way of really engaging students and arousing their interest in these particular interesting and important countries. Thanks, Nick. We've invited people who are doing research and who are at the forefront of the field in the various countries that we've selected to include in the book. So, for example, Fang Cooke has written the chapter on China. She's based at Monash University in Australia, but she is Chinese national, and she's engaged in a range of research projects on China. She's one of the leading authorities who write in the English language about China. In the United States, the two contributors who've been with us for the last couple of editions or so are Harry Katz and Alex Colvin, who are both at the Industrial and Labour Relations School at Cornell University, which is one of the major centres for the study of this field in the US, indeed in the world. And in Europe, some of the contributors include Jeremy Waddington, who's based at Manchester University in England. He's very much at the forefront of analysing British industrial relations. He's an expert on unions across Europe. And in France, Patrice Laroche is based in Paris at the ESCP. He's joined the team this time for the first occasion. He's very much a leading scholar in analysing French employment relations. So those are examples of some of the contributors that are included in this 6th edition. Russell, you might wish to add some others from the team.
Sure. Well, Greg, we also have groups of, or teams, if you like, of authors from different places. For example, a group at the Department of Sociology, University of Copenhagen, have contributed a very interesting chapter on the Danish model, which of course has become quite well known for flexicurity as an example of the way they approach issues like industrial relations. In Germany, we have Anja Kirsch at the Free University in Berlin, as well as Bernd Keller, who is a well-known scholar of German industrial relations. And then in Asia, we have a team based around Waseda University in Japan, as well as in India, we have a combination of Anil Verma, who is the head of the Industrial Relations Centre at the University of Toronto, and Sundar Shyam, who's based at the Francis Xavier University in India. So all in all, we really have an excellent team of contributors from a wide range of countries who are experts in their field and with whom we have worked closely over several decades now in some cases. So we're delighted that these people could join us, and we're very indebted to the contributions that they have made.
The book also benefits from contributions from some of the leading and preeminent scholars in the field of employment relations across the world, such as Lucio Beccara at the University of Geneva and Valeria Pugliano, authoring the chapter on Italy. We have Byung-Hoon Lee, authoring the chapter on Korea, and we have the chapter in Canada being authored by Daphne Taras and Scott Walsworth.
And they're at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, and Daphne was a contributor to the previous edition, and Scott has joined the team for this edition in terms of renewing the team.